Welcome to a very important podcast episode here at The Wealthy Ironworker. Today's podcast episode is entitled The Positive Ripple Effects of the UAW. After the historic vote in Chattanooga, Tennessee, a couple of weeks back, where the employees voted by 73% to be represented by the union, I decided to do a little bit of research. First up, I wanted to know how much money from a net profit or net income perspective every single foreign automaker had in their coffers. Likewise, I also wanted to look at what percentage of wage rate hikes that they had committed to in direct response to what the UAW has done, hence the positive ripple effects that I'm talking about. But it goes a little further than that. We then take a look at what the governors of each state in the South condemn the UAW, talking about it, and we can kind of see what their approach to socioeconomics are. Then we look at something that I don't know if anybody else is actually talking about or has even alluded to, and that's the Japanese model. Now, the Japanese model and approach to socioeconomics dealing with business and their citizenry is drastically different than their American elected official counterparts. And dare I say that our American elected officials have something to learn. After that, we take a look at prominent conservatives in this country who actually take an issue with the way that our current economic model is concerned and how it exploits and creates problems for workers. And during that little segment in the podcast, I actually misspeak. I said salacious. What I meant to say was solicitous. You'll see in the narrative where that comes about. After that, we begin to talk about populism. Populism as a movement can be an enormous effective change in the country. Think about when the time where we got rid of child labor, we instituted the 40-hour work week, we introduced weekends, we dealt with monopolies. During that time, turn of the century, populism was a great avenue for change. But populism also can be used, or hijacked rather, for demagogues. Think during the 1930s. This is when Nazism and fascism rose to power. They rose to power because of the great despair that the Industrial Revolution and the income inequality created. I contend in the podcast episode that we are not too far away from that point today. Therefore, we should discuss populism, the positives that it can bring out, also the dangers, all right? And that, in a nutshell, is a very important podcast episode that I want to bring to you. I hope you'll take it and maybe let it sink into your mind a little bit and, quite frankly, probably challenge some of your paradigms going forward, all right? So, come on in the studio. Let's join the conversation. And, what you've got going on in the labor movement in general. For example, when we look at this kind of got this kicked off in, let's say, October, right? Striketober, which was 2022. There was an enormous amount of strikes, and as far as labor is concerned, it kicked off, what I would say anyway, was a very prosperous year in 2023 and moving forward. Certainly 2024 is very poised then to propel the labor movement as far as organized labor. And to see what's kind of going on, peek under the cover, if you will, and to understand, all of the dynamics that are coming across that. Now, when you think about the end of 2022, what were we coming out of? That's right. We were coming out of the end of the pandemic. Now, what's very illustrative about the pandemic, and a lot of people, even though it's not a part of this episode, or the associated website that much of this podcast episode is built off of, what the pandemic illustrated, it was a massive transfer of wealth. You, the auto worker, or the construction worker, skilled tradesmen and women, just like myself, you were deemed essential. Didn't matter if you got COVID or not. Now, we can have a discussion about COVID and its lethalness and whatnot, its originator and all that stuff. But while the pandemic was going on, you were viewed essential. We didn't care about whether it was raging on your job site, in your facility or not. It didn't matter. Likewise, it was a massive transfer of wealth, and not from top down, but from bottom up. You look at the number of places that were allowed to stay open, like your large grocery chains, your Walmarts, your Home Depots, your Lowe's, etc. But the mom and pop places where you would interact with far fewer individuals, they were forced to close down. It was a massive transfer of wealth. Now, on the heels of this massive transfer of wealth, we begin to see people go, enough is enough. We have had enough, and we're willing to go on strike. Ergo, October of 2022 was called Striketober. A fitting name, I think, but it led into, of course, 2023. We begin to see the massive number of what I would say is organizing campaigns. You saw every single one of the big three, not just the automakers, but America, Delta, United, their contracts with their pilots and stewardesses. You had Kaiser Permanente is the largest, I believe, the largest hospital or healthcare, I should say, the largest healthcare issue when it comes to organized labor. The writer strike, this is pretty large, and it got a fair amount of news coverage as well. The UPS with the Teamsters, and of course, the UAW and the big three out of Detroit. Now, today's podcast episode, just like I touched on in the introduction of this video, we're going to talk about a multitude of things that are going to be very, very illustrative going forward. There's a lot of information out there to glean from. I took a deep dive. I gathered a bunch of information, and we're going to talk about this, okay? So we're talking about a labor movement and organizing drive that represents, by the way, the worker. We're talking about a 20-year high in labor, kicking off, representing individuals who are not recognized and who have historically been recognized. So as we go through this, think about that. We're on a 20-year high. So the first section that we're going to talk about, and it's going to be very illustrative, I believe, is I call it on the website in the article, take a look at the money. Take a look at the money. I did. I took the time and I compiled a spreadsheet that is also on the article. When I make going forward, let me just say this. When I make a statement, when I say the government said this, the company said this, et cetera, this article has every single website linked to it. So you can go to the article, click on the link, and it will take you to the source data. I am not making up any of this. All of this going forward, you can find on the website. And every single talking point, as far as money and everything else that I'm about to say, has source material linked in the website. All right, going forward, looking at the money. We're going to spend a fair amount of time focused on Volkswagen. I'm going to talk about every single other automaker, but we'll talk about Volkswagen in a more focused way. And the reason why is because, number one, they are the freshest on the mind when it comes to auto plants. Number two, they happen to be the one that I did the most research on. But the UAW sits down. Before GM even ratified their agreement, less than 2 weeks, let me make sure that I am clear on this, less than 2 weeks before this has been ratified and out, Toyota, Honda, and Hyundai. The first two, Toyota and Honda, are Japanese car makers. Hyundai, is South Korean. All three of them decide to raise wages for their employees. Is the timing suspect? No. No, it's not. We're going to look at this, but the timing is not suspect. It's and by the way, almost every single automaker that we're going to talk about today has said they're going to raise wages. And the reason why they're raising wages is to stave off, to push off, is to keep you, the worker. If you're watching this or listening to this, depending on how you consume podcast content, if you are listening to this or watching this, they want to keep you satisfied just enough that you don't vote to be represented and say and take a collective stand, by the way, and say, I want to be represented. I want to have somebody represent me, sit across the table from my employer and say, I want better for myself. All of these companies could have indeed raised wages years before. The profit margins, the net profit is what we will talk about. They were not too astronomically different than what we're going to talk about today from a 2023 perspective, but they didn't. And the reason why they didn't is because of what the UAW has done. And this, ergo, the positive ripple effects of what's going on. John F. Kennedy talked about a rising tide lifting all boats. That's exactly what's going on today. So let's look at the money. Volkswagen. We're going to talk about net profits. I'm going to list the auto manufacturer. I'm going to list net profits, and then I'm going to list the actual wage amount that they committed to raising. All of them after what the UAW has done. Number one, Volkswagen. Volkswagen's net profit in 2023, $19.6 billion. They committed to an 11% raise for the only non-union plant, at least up until the vote, in Chattanooga, Tennessee. 11%. They voted 73%, an overwhelming number, to become union because they realized the money is there. The UAW has demonstrated this. Tesla's net profit for 2023, $15 billion. Now, internal documents, you can find this also on the website. Internal documents said their current wages were $22 to $39 an hour, and they were unsure of the total raise amount, but they were going to raise the wages. I could not find an actual percentage. It all depended upon where you lived at and your cost of living. Mercedes, which is the next plant, listen up, $15.7 billion in net profit. They decided they're going to raise wages 6%, and they ended their two-tier pay scale once the union drive kicked off. 6%, and they were at $15.7 billion. Now, caveat for this, I don't have the number. I watched a YouTube video while I was doing the research, and they had elected, at least the video alleged, that Mercedes had elected to pay their CEO an 80% bump, as well as their board. Hooray for me, but not for thee. $15.7 billion in net profit in 2023. Hyundai, $9.2 billion. Hyundai, remember, was one of the three that elected to, within not even 2 weeks after the UAW had come out and said we've got an agreement hammered out, we're going to raise wages. Hyundai has committed to raising their wages for the next 4 years 25%. 25% in the next 4 years. Why? Timing seems kind of suspect. Yes, it is. And the reason why is because of the rippling effect of what the UAW has done. Next manufacturer, Honda. Honda's net income for 2023, $6.692 billion, and they have committed to a 9% wage increase after the UAW announced their historic wins. Toyota's net profit for 2023, an amazing $31.796 billion, and they committed to an 11% raise. Now, contrast an 11% raise with almost $32 billion to Hyundai's $9.2 billion and a 9%, or a 25% over the next 4 years wage, Pretty interesting. Nissan, total net profit for 2023, $3.079 billion. The raise that they have allocated their workers, or said so, 10%. Subaru, $1.483 billion. And I could not find a website. They said I could find plenty of websites that said they had committed to raise wages. I could not find a website that gave me a specific amount. What I did find, and is also linked in the website, was a Reddit forum where internal employees had said it's going to be 6%. They are an Indiana facility. lastly, on my spreadsheet, Mazda's 1.066 billion. Mazda was the only manufacturer that I could not find a specific raise amount in addition to Tesla. I could not find that. Now, Barron's also reported that Volvo's net profit for 2023 was 4.51 billion. They're union in some places, but they are non-union in South Carolina, and they have committed to raising wages to 11% of what they currently are. Again, all of these percentages were after what the UAW has achieved. The timing is not suspect. It's very easy to read the writing on the wall. Now, by way of contrast, let me just clear this out. For 2023, in case you were wondering, for the big three, up in Detroit where UAW won significant concessions, Ford's net profit for 2023 was 4.3 billion. GM's was 1 billion and 10 billion, excuse me. I'm sorry. GM's was 10 billion and Stellantis had a net profit of $20 billion. 20 billion. GM's was 10 and Ford's was 4.3. There is money there. And the UAW knew it, which is why they went to the collective bargaining to the table and collectively bargained for the better of their members. That's what you have going on. Now, the timing is not coincidence. It's in direct response to what the UAW has going on. Now, this prompted then, of course, a union drive at Chattanooga, Tennessee with Volkswagen, which 2014 and 2019, there were also organizing drives. But there were some differences here. Number one, we're fresh off, or relatively fresh anyway, off the heels of a pandemic, as well as the fact that the UAW has won significant concessions from the big three. Again, you can go back to the website and you can see these numbers in bold as well as their source. In response to this being the organizing drive in Chattanooga, the organizing drive in Chattanooga elicited some negative responses, of course, from Governor Lee of Tennessee. And what did he say? After the employees of the facility voted by an amazing 73% to be represented by the UAW, he said it was a mistake. He said the employees and that Chattanooga Volkswagen facility, which, by the way, are his constituents, he said, you made a mistake. Now, at least he had the wherewithal to acknowledge the fact that it was your choice, but he said it was a mistake. Prior to the actual vote, remember, Governor Lee's was a response to the vote, but prior to the vote, the governors of Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Tennessee, South Carolina, and Texas, 6 governors, specifically made a joint statement condemning the UAW and how they don't represent the quote unquote values we live by. What they're doing effectively, just so we're clear, is that they are hijacking specific language. The joint statement is also found on the website, and it's very interesting because at the very top of this, you have a picture of all 6 governors, their headshots for their official photos that they send out, and they said, stand with auto workers. Stand with. Well, when they elect to be represented, do you stand with them then? Or do you say, quote, you made a mistake? I would say that you don't stand with them. That's but what you do stand with is your economic model, which is built on low wages and using taxpayer dollars to incentivize or pay companies, in a nutshell, to come to your place, to come to your state, to come to the locale and set up shop. In this case for Volkswagen, and the number is pretty astronomical, from the time that they came on into Tennessee in 2007 and then 7 years later, the combined amount of money that Tennessee has given Volkswagen, whether it is in what they call it economic incentive, $814 million. $814 million. So in other words, what's happening ultimately, the various state governments will use your taxpayer dollars. It's exactly what's going on. They will use your taxpayer dollars to pay, or quote unquote, use an economic incentive to bring businesses back, to try and get them to come. You're competing. We're going lower and lower and lower as far as the amount of money that companies need to invest. Instead, we're going to use your taxpayer dollars to do so. And we don't want you standing together and saying, we want our fair share. We're tired of living in poverty, which I might add, all 6 of the states lead the nation, and they're in the top 21. All 6 of those states are in the top 21, not in overall wealth, in overall poverty. Mississippi, far and above, leads everyone else at a rate of 19.1, according to census data. Almost 1/5 of the entire state of Mississippi lives below the federal poverty level. Alabama is not too far behind it with 16 point something. So again, overall, comparing the amount of wealth the state actually does nothing when it comes to the amount of poverty citizenry is in. You look very similar to the structure of corporations in that they've got a lot of money at the top, and the citizenry or the workers in the comparison have relatively none. What good does it do you, the individual worker, if your government and elected officials have enormous amounts of money, but you do not? And many of you are in the federal poverty level. It does nothing for you. That's the point I'm trying to make here, is that the elected officials who are supposed to, and by the way, let me just say this. Your elected officials are supposed to represent you. Let me put this out there. You vote them in, they are supposed to represent the constituents. In this case, it could be Tennessee, Texas, whatever your state happens to be. There was a viral video that went, let's say maybe a month ago. It might have been even 2 months ago. Adam Morgan, the representative from South Carolina, had it out with some of his own individual, with his own members in the party in Columbia, in the state house, arguing. I get that you want me to vote and the lobbyists want me to vote a specific way, but my constituents whom I represent want me to vote this way. They want their tax dollars going for core government services, not picking and choosing winners and losers, not deciding where the factories are going to be, who gets to go work for them, etc. In effect, what he is ultimately saying is this: I want to represent the people who put me here, and government. All 6 states are, have Republican governors, by the way. The governors, effectively what he's describing is big business is in bed with big government. Now, we normally think of big government in bed at the federal or national level. Not so. Not so. It is very much the model in the South. Big government at the state level is routinely in bed with big corporations. And guess what? They're using your tax dollars to do it. That's it. And while they're using your tax dollars to quote unquote economically incentivize those companies to set up shop in your state, if you will, all the while they don't want you to stand up and come collectively and say, I want to be represented. I want to collectively, that's what collective bargaining means. I want to come together collectively as a group, bargain or negotiate with my employer. That's what collective bargaining effectively is. And we say this all the time in the United States. United we stand, divided we fall. It's the same exact thing at the worker level. They want to keep you divided, and they want to use your tax dollars to get in bed with big business and decide where the job should be, who should be the winners, who should be the losers. And to add insult to injury, your government officials, the ones who are elected, if using your tax dollars from an economic incentive perspective were not particularly distasteful enough, they will tell you that you can stand up for your own rights. as an individual, and they will specifically tell you that you don't need a third party, i.e. the UAW, to represent you. You can stand up for your own rights. All the while they are talking to the representatives, the third parties, the lobbyists for the company. The company, the corporation, they have a third party. They have a representative. They have someone speaking on their interests. The second that you elect to have someone speak up for you, you've made a mistake. That's what you have going on here. In effect, if I could put this bluntly, overall, when it comes to hierarchy of care, you, the constituents of your respective states, you're relatively low on the totem pole. The company, the corporation, they're up here. You may have voted for them, but they're going to use your tax dollars and give them to companies to get them to come over here and get them in bed. And they're listening to their representatives and discourage you from having representatives. That's ultimately what's going on. Take it. And again, you can go to the website and you can see the various talking points, the counterpoints back and forth from individuals and entities, industries, institutions, etc. Now, moving on from this, while I was doing a deep dive into the data, I was basically what I was looking for is Mazda's information. I could not find Mazda's information, but let me tell you what I did find. The Japanese government, if you want a greater parallel with what your state governments are doing to you and how they do not care for you, let's look at what the government of Japan does. All right? Again, you can find the link on the website. Quote, Prime Minister, I won't say his name because I'll probably butcher it all up, but the Prime Minister's government has repeatedly asked business leaders to increase wages at a pace that exceeds inflation. Rising prices for everyday goods due to higher raw material costs and the weak yen have weighed on households. End quote. The government is actually talking to business, and they are saying, we want you to raise workers' wages. By the way, every single car manufacturer over there has a labor union representing them. So what are the results of the government actually going to bat for them? Quote, Toyota, seen as a trendsetter at the annual Shunto wage negotiations, said it had fully met the request of its labor union, which had demanded its largest pay hike since 1999, end quote. That was Toyota. Nissan, quote, Nissan agreed to increase monthly wages by 18,000 yen on average, the biggest rise for the company since 2005 when its current wage system was introduced, end quote. Quote, Honda Motor Company is offering its largest monthly pay rise since 1989, end quote. What a difference you get to see when you compare the government of Japan that actually sticks up for its citizenry and not for big business. The two come together, and Japan says, I want you to raise wages for your employees above the rate of inflation. And they're represented. And the results are what I just said they were. That's a novel form of government. You mean the government is actually sticking up for the people that they actually represent? What a novel idea. Now, the article also said, quote, with the momentum for wage increases growing, the focus is now on whether the positive effect will trickle down to small and medium-sized firms, which employ about 70% of the country's laborers. In recent years, the Japanese government has intensified its efforts to shield smaller firms from the pressure exerted by larger companies to unreasonably lower prices, enabling these firms to earn enough to raise wages. Japan's antitrust watchdog earlier this month warned Nissan about illegally reducing payments to 36 subcontractors. Nissan President Makoto Yoshida apologized on Wednesday for the scandal and said the company will respond sincerely to suppliers intending to pass increased costs on to the automaker. Imagine that. Not only is the government of Japan looking out for the workers of the automakers, the Toyota, Honda, Nissan, Mazda, they are also looking out for their suppliers and don't want you passing on the cost either. What we want you to do is incur the cost yourselves because they are stakeholders in your company's success. As a Japanese company, you should be looking and investing into your stakeholders, which happen to be, in this case, your employees. Imagine that. Representative government doing exactly what it is supposed to do, which is represent those constituents. In this case, it's Japan. When we compare this to what's going on in the 6 southern states that have condemned the UAW for standing up for workers' rights, it is anathema. They should be ashamed of themselves and what they're doing and their line of reasoning, instead saying we want better for the constituents of our state. Instead, we're in bed with big business, and we want you, the worker, to bear the brunt of everything. And we'll use your tax dollars to do it. Thank you very much. Now, what's very interesting to me, moving on from this particular point, American Compass. I discovered American Compass some years back. I was doing a capstone project. I discovered American Compass, was very interested to find out that they are a conservative think tank of all things. A conservative think tank. And let me tell you what they said, and I will tell you who is very illustrative as who is actually on, who signed off on this brief. I think it's from 2020. Quote, American conservatives rightly place economic freedom and limited government among our dearest values. The defense of markets, though, has at times made us overly solicitous of businesses. As we advocate for owners and managers in their pursuit of profit and celebrate the enormous benefits their efforts can generate for us all, we must accord the same respect to the concerns of workers and ensure that they too have a seat at the table. In a well-functioning and competitive market, participants meet as equals, able to advance their interests through mutually beneficial relationships. Strong worker representation can make America stronger. They continue. Unfortunately, our nation's Great Depression era labor laws no longer provide an effective framework. Many unions have become unresponsive to workers' needs, and membership has fallen to 6% of the private sector workforce. Rather than cheer the demise of a once valuable institution, conservatives should seek reform and reinvigoration of the laws that govern organizing and collective bargaining for 3 reasons, end quote, for which they go on and say. Do you know what this means? This means there are prominent conservatives who recognize the systemic problem with the economic model that many big business, big government individuals they propose, and they continually perpetrate. They consider talk about it over and over and over again. And I'll tell you what's very, very interesting to me is that the 2 specific high-known conservatives who signed off on this brief are current Florida Senator Marco Rubio and former state senator and former Attorney General Jeff Sessions of none other than Alabama. Imagine that. Somebody has a difference of opinion when it comes to Alabama's representative government. In this case, their governor itself. An American conservative, there is a rotten problem when big business is in bed with big government, and we routinely make the mistake of thinking that it's at the federal level. Yes, it is, but it is just as entrenched at the state level as well. And that's the point and the takeaway that we need to recognize. We need to understand this. And for those of you who might be listening to this podcast and who might be casting a vote from an organizing perspective, What the elites do not want you to do is to have access to the amount of information that I'm giving in this podcast today, as well as you standing up for your rights. They know this. And if you want any greater indication that they fear workers coming together, taking a stand and saying, no more, we want to be represented, it's the fact that 6 Southern governors come out before the UA drive actually happens and becomes overwhelmingly successful in Chattanooga, trying to head this off. They do not like populism, which is my next point, and which is where we're going to plant the flag and end the podcast, is on populism. The major effect, the major weapon, what you, the worker, and the citizenry as a whole have at your disposal is a populism movement. The populism movement is nothing more to be, if you want an accurate definition, we'll go with Oxford languages, but it's a political approach that strives to appeal to ordinary people who feel that their concerns are disregarded by established elite groups, big business and big government in your state as well. And if you can't look and see that at the state level and at the corporation level, they don't care about you because the two are effectively one in a lot of ways, then I am hoping that I can wake you up and understand that they do not care about you. They don't. And populism as a result is rising. It's why wages have been stagnant. It's why greedflation accounts for over half of all. When you look at the corporate, because these are public traded companies, they have to sit here, and this is how I found all the data in the first place. They have to report how much their net profit, they have to report all this stuff. Their net income is out there. Most people don't take the time to navigate through. All of the prices that you're seeing an increase on goods and services and the amount of money when it comes to like the grocery store and stuff, it's all greedflation. Over half, to be sure, over half is primarily driven by greedflation. And when you feel the squeeze coming on, just know that by and large, your elected officials do not care. Because if they did, what they would do, their response would be something akin to what the Japanese government is doing and talking to the corporations and talking to them and saying, pay your workers, give them a wage, a raise that is over and above what inflation is. What they say instead is, of course, we already know, you don't need to be represented. United you stand, divided you fall. Now, the growing rise of populism is largely as a direct result of not being listened to and not being able to get ahead and not being able to deal with situations and not being able to afford to pay anything and not being able to do anything, and your head is just right here underwater. And more, the growing income inequality gulf, it is massive and it continues to grow, and you get a populist movement. Now, the only thing that I would say about a populist movement, and I happen to agree with Robert Kennedy Jr. on this, is that a populist movement can indeed be hijacked. On the website, I specifically link to a conversation that he has with a very prominent conservative named Glenn Beck. Glenn Beck is a conservative, and yet he says, I think this narrative that this left versus right is a distraction. When in reality, what we really have going on is the elites versus everybody else. And I'm here to tell you that they're absolutely right. And then, of course, Robert Kennedy Jr. starts to talk about this growing rise in populism and how it can be a force for good. It was a force for good back in the early 1900s, like 1902, 1903, 1904, when we began the Sherman Antitrust Act. You started to see the 40-hour work week come around, weekends, no child labor, etc. Where it went off the trails was in the 1930s. And the reason why it went off the rails in the 1930s, because it was the same problem then is because it can easily be hijacked. Ergo, I introduce to you one of my favorite books that I've read, Peter Drucker, Managing in the Next Society. This book is 22 years old. And I'm going to read something that Peter Drucker specifically said, because he passed away, unfortunately, right after this book. But Peter Drucker was alive during the 1930s. And here is what Mr. Drucker had to say to someone when they specifically said, you have criticisms of capitalism. Why is this? Quote, he writes, I am for the free market, even though it doesn't work too well. Nothing else works at all. But I have serious reservations about capitalism as a system because it idealizes economics as the be-all and end-all of life. It is one-dimensional. For example, I have often advised managers that a 20-to-1 salary ratio is the limit beyond which they cannot go if they don't want resentment and falling morale to hit their companies. I worried back in the 1930s that the great inequality generated by the Industrial Revolution would result in so much despair that something like fascism would take hold. Unfortunately, I was right. End quote. He saw what could happen with populism as a whole. So I urge you then to remember this and think about this. As we move forward from a populist movement, remember that capitalism does indeed work when, and only when, organized labor stands up for your collective rights. It sounds like I'm saying this over and over again because I'm trying to drive the point home. United we stand, divided we fall. They want you divided. It's left versus right. Race wars and all this other stuff. It's all a distraction. It's all a distraction. I want you, the worker, to remember then that organized labor is the only real substantive weapon that you have at your disposal to overcome this income inequality gulf and to seize populism as a whole and keep it on track. All right? And I'd like to end with this. I'm going to continue Peter Drucker's quote where he talks about this as a systemic problem. He continues, today, I believe it is socially and morally unforgivable when managers reap huge profits for themselves, but fire workers. As societies, we will pay a heavy price for the contempt this generates among the middle managers and workers. In short, whole dimensions of what it means to be a human being and treated as one are not incorporated into the economic calculus of capitalism. For such a myopic system to dominate other aspects of life, it is not good for any society. The only effective weapon that organized workers have at their disposal is to be organized. And if you're unorganized, it's to get organized. Now, if you are listening to this podcast and you are legitimate and genuinely curious about you want some questions answered, feel free to go over to thewealthyironworker.com. You can go to the contact page. There'll be a form filled out. You can ask me any question you want. I will take the time to answer you. If there are enough questions, I will do another podcast and I will adequately explain to the best of my ability what's going on, the best answer. But organized labor is not, I repeat, it is not the demon that you have been led to believe. It is, in effect, the only weapon you have to keep you from being a serf. Populism is on the rise. My suggestion is to do your homework and to vote accordingly, especially when you are faced with an election. There's a lot of information out there, but big business and big government, even at the state level, are in bed together. They are in bed together. And lastly, if you want to see any of the data that I have compiled for this podcast episode, you can go to thewealthyironworker.com. It's under the musing tab, and it is the rippling effect, the positive rippling effect of what has been going on with the UAW. All right? This is The Wealthy Ironworker. Thank you for listening to this podcast. See you on the next one.